Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our event. My name is Tom Lindsay, and I direct the Center for Innovation and Education here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And on behalf of our foundation, it's a true honor and a pleasure to introduce our event titled The War on Poverty, Overcoming Government Dependence in America. Now, in 1964, President Lyndon Johnson announced the quote-unquote Great Society proposal, which would create new welfare programs, expand food stamps, give birth to both Medicaid and Medicare, fund the arts, and much, much more. It would also continue the departure from nearly 200 years of our constitutional tradition and increase the federal government's involvement in local education. Look at the Constitution and you will not find that power given to the federal government, but it has been taken, as we know. President Johnson and those who supported the programs believed in their hearts that greater government involvement in education especially, in preschool all the way through high school, that this would finally break the cycle of poverty in America. So when the president told the American people that they must, quote, accept greater government activity in their affairs, unquote, little did we know how destructive a bargain we were making. Right? In 1965, the Great Society's War on Poverty began a massive infusion of federal tax dollars and involvement in pre-K and K-12 education. It also created new taxpayer underwritten student loans and grants for the general public to attend college. Since that time, federal taxpayers, us, have spent $2 trillion on K-12 education alone, to say nothing of the billions spent every year on student loans and grants for college. All of which leads to the question, what have we gotten for this massive increase in our taxes and for the decrease in our individual liberty and also the power of the states? Well, that's the subject of this event, which I'm honored to present. And we have got 3 panels that are going to go very quickly and that have a lot of information. So I'm just going to turn over right now to the Heritage Foundation's Jennifer Marshall, who will begin our first panel, Overcoming Poverty in America. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Tom, for that introduction. On behalf of Lindsay Burke, my colleague at the Heritage Foundation, and myself, we want to thank TPPF for partnering in this event with us and providing this lovely venue. It really is wonderful to be here, so thank you. We are here today because we want to help more Americans overcome poverty. Now, in recent decades, there has been quite a bit of attention to the material welfare of those in poverty. And that's with good reason, of course, but less attention has been paid to their overall well-being. Human flourishing, of course, includes material well-being, but we can't reduce it to that. It also includes relational well-being, opportunities to develop one's potential through education and work,
and prospects of pursuing
meaningful
endeavors through life. Well, today's anti-poverty efforts can be traced back to the mid-1960s when President Lyndon Johnson launched the War on Poverty. President Johnson said at the time that he wanted everyone to have, quote, a fair chance to develop their own capacities, end quote. Since then, government has spent more than $25 trillion
fighting poverty, but it has not succeeded in making more Americans self-sufficient by developing their own capacities, as Johnson hoped. Today, government spends more than $1 trillion per year on 90 federal means-tested programs providing cash, food, housing, medical, and other social services to poor and low-income Americans. The material living standards of those in poverty in the United States have improved substantially in the last 50 years. According to federal survey data, today the typical family with children considered poor by the federal government has at least one car, more living space than the average household in France, a microwave, cable television, many more amenities. We should be thankful for the positive outcome of improved material conditions, but we cannot be satisfied with it. That's because it comes at the cost of dependence on government, and it coincides with other declining indicators of human well-being. The strategy of the last 50 years may have raised the material living standard of the poor, but it has not raised the true standard of human flourishing. Poverty in America goes far deeper than material need. It has a great deal to do with relational need. In particular, child poverty is related to father absence. At the beginning of the war on poverty in the 1960s, 8% of children were born outside of marriage. Today, that figure is 40% overall and more than 70% for blacks. Now, a child born outside of marriage is 5 times more likely to experience poverty than a child raised by a married mother and father. These are serious matters, and tackling this kind of challenge is much more complicated than calling for more federal tax dollars. Overcoming poverty and dependence on government welfare will require efforts to restore marriage and to connect people to opportunity through better education and work. Now, as was mentioned, our second and third panels today are going to focus on reforming education beyond the failed promises of the War on Poverty model. For our first panel, we will be focusing on a better way when it comes to welfare generally. We are going to be talking about concrete examples of real personal transformation. And behind this, just as a kind of backdrop for this more concrete local conversation, I want to name 2 basic goals for federal policy reform that are characterizing the approach we're talking about here today. So these 2 federal policy welfare reform goals. The first is promoting work. When government provides aid that discourages work for those who are able, it disserves the very people it was intended to help. Instead, assistance should be designed to provide for basic needs while pointing a person on a path towards work which respects their dignity and better serves their long-term flourishing. Second, policy should stop penalizing marriage. Given the correlation between the collapse of marriage and child poverty, it's important and basic that public assistance should not undermine marriage. And yet, current policy penalizes it. A single mother stands to lose welfare benefits if she marries a man with a job. That should be changed, and at Heritage we proposed a specific way to do that through the Earned Income Tax Credit as one example. Well, these are modest steps that the government can take to help in serving those in need overcome poverty. But at the same time, private groups are achieving transformational results in the lives of individuals and communities. Religious groups in particular have enormous potential to take on this challenge, and I'm very pleased, therefore, that we have 2 panelists here today from Catholic Charities in Fort Worth to tell us about the impact that they are having. Cindy Casey is the Director of Client Strategy Services. She oversees a number of programs, including an initiative called the Padua Pilot, which began in 2014 in partnership with the University of Notre Dame. One of the things I appreciated in reading about Cindy's work is her emphasis on holistic service to those in need. And she's been with CCFW for 9 years. Shannon Rosedale serves as the Opportunity Assessment Coordinator at Catholic Charities Fort Worth. Her passion and unwillingness to settle for the status quo jumps right off the page when you read her bio. She's driven by the question, what would it take to end poverty? And every day she's rallying a diverse set of allies to try to accomplish that goal. So I'm going to join them here, and we're going to have a conversation for about 25 minutes, and then we want to open it up to you for about 12 to 15 minutes of questions as well. So keep your questions in mind as we're having this conversation. Ladies, welcome. It's really a joy to have you here. And I want to pose the first question to Shannon. And do you need to do a mic? Thank you. Okay.
Good morning. Good morning, ladies. Cindy and Shannon, thank you for being here. I would like to pose this to Shannon. Tell me just a little bit about your organization and the character of the work you're doing to help overcome welfare dependence.
Sure. So about 6 years ago at Catholic Charities Fort Worth, we started asking the question, what would it look like to really shake up services? What would it look like if we weren't focused on repeat customers? If we weren't pursuing this business model of giving the same type of services to the same people month after month just because they're eligible again for it or because this is what we can do because of whether it's the government giving us the funding for it through grants or other private foundations. And so we said, what would it really take if we no strings attached end poverty for families? What would that look like, and how could we prove that we're really successful? And so we first started saying, okay, let's take a look at our basic programs. So we did case management, we did housing, we did rent assistance, utilities assistance, and we looked at that and said, what are the results that we're getting? Can we actually say that after somebody has walked through our doors and they've called us, that they are better off for the rest of their life because of the money we've used, because of how we've treated them? And we kept seeing that, no, not really. We couldn't stand on that and say that these people's lives are completely different because they came to Catholic Charities Fort Worth. And so we said, what would it take then? What would that look like? And so we started just kind of pursuing that thought more and more, and we redid a lot of our services. We first started with the question again of what would it take and what would it look like? We said we think being out of poverty, being self-sufficient looks beyond just meeting your basic needs, but it looks like having a job that's paying a living wage, which means that you can meet not only your basic needs, but what it actually takes to survive, what it actually takes to meet all of the things without going further into debt or relying on government assistance. And so that's one of the ways that we measure when we say that people are out of poverty because of Catholic Charities Fort Worth services. It means that they have a living wage job that they're able to provide for their families. It means that they are saving. So every month they are putting, money into a savings account, and they understand the behaviors of why it is so important to have that safety net, their own personal safety net, so that if something comes up, they're able to access that without going into, further into debt or going to another place to get more assistance. That third piece is removing any negative debt. So anything that's not asset bearing, that's causing high interest rates, that's causing them to continue stumbling, we want to remove that as well. And then lastly, being off of government assistance is our biggest thing, is that when somebody is stable, when they are able to provide for all their basic needs, to provide for their families, they're no longer utilizing government assistance. And so with those four things, we really use that as a framework for how we address poverty within our programs and as well as externally with the policies we were working on or supporting, as well as just the way we talk to funders and talk to foundations and talk to other partners of this is really what we believe we should be working towards. And so we've started just addressing that within internally. So all of our programs, we've shifted to really focusing again on that framework of these financial benchmarks. But even within that, we've realized just because you have money in the bank or you have a job, it doesn't mean that you have the skill set or the actual skills and knowledge to be successful. What else does that take? Somebody can get a job, but if they don't have the soft skills to know that you have to show up on time or the mental capacity to be able to say, if I put this money in savings versus purchasing this thing now, what does that look like? Does that look like long-term success? And so we really work on this idea of this executive functioning that Cindy will talk a little bit more about as well.
Great. Okay, I need to turn that on, right? So just to take this from where Shannon had discussed, our development of executive function comes in what we call a foundation of overall well-being. And this really hits hard with what Jennifer had mentioned. Our overall well-being isn't just your physical health. It's looking at your emotional well-health. It's looking at the client's mental well-being, their relationship well-being. Our supports that we build with our client isn't just about making sure that a client is housed or that they have food, but that the relationship with the immediate family members, the people living with them, are not going to be so that they're deterring their success. So this takes time. You have to be able to build trust with the client. And we start this from the very beginning when client is coming in the door. We make sure that we are providing informed consent for the client. They know what they're getting involved in when they come in the door for one of our case management programs. What Shannon discussed a couple seconds ago was a very short summary of what we went through in about a 4-year period where we've developed what we now consider to be our signature case management model. And it's different. It's different from a lot of other agencies that are out there in that we have moved away from providing transactional help. I'm not going to say that if we don't have some funding that sometimes somebody calling up and needing help to get a rent payment, it's not going to happen. But for the most part, they are moving into one of our case management programs where there's no financial assistance. And that financial assistance is tied to the development of executive function, which I'll discuss a little bit more later on. One of the biggest things that we do when our clients are coming in the door in this process of informed consent is to make sure that they know that they're entering a case management program that is not only long-term, but it's not built on financial assistance. Coming through the door with us means that you are willing and able to work, and that's described fully to them. We have a lot of clients who come in the door who may be able physically to work, but maybe it's a mom with 4 kids and she really doesn't want to leave her kids at home. She's making that decision then that she's going to live off of what she has and she's not going to come into the case management program. If you're coming in with us, the goal is to get to 40 hours a week of work. It doesn't happen necessarily immediately, but they know that's the goal, and that if you're not on board for that, this isn't the program for you. As a result of that, we've had a lot of clients opt out to come in to begin with, and our retention rates of the clients that have come in have been exceedingly large. With the Padua pilot that Jennifer mentioned, after 12 months, we've got a 60% retention. That's unheard of, and it's because people know what they're coming in for. They know that it's going to be hard work, and they're on board for that.
Since I've been corresponding with you, you've been illustrating and emphasizing relationships, and I think you in particular, Cindy, wanted to tell us about the importance of relationship in the work that you do.
Yeah. There's a couple things that make the Padua pilot and our signature case management at Catholic Charities a little bit different. First is that it's very directional. So the whole financial objectives that Shannon was talking about, those are tied to what we call a client's bigger, brighter future, right? They see that they have a long-term goal. There aren't too many goals you can get to in this world if you're not going to have a financial component tied to it, and they see the importance of that. In addition, what makes us different is the way our case management model is structured. Everybody has a 2-person team. Every client that comes through the door, case manager, which is really more that clinical role of engagement, getting that foundation of well-being set up, those type of things. Then it's the way we do our financial assistance. And this is that development of executive function, and everything here is tied on the relationship with the client and that trust. Sometimes it can take up to 12 months to get a trust established with the client where they really believe that you're there to help them plan. We're not doing it with them, we're at equals at the table. The client is coming in saying, this is what I can bring to the table. The case management team is there saying, this is what I can bring to the table. And it's a different approach. If you're going to do financial assistance with us, there's a whole process to it that is all built along the client's input. We've also developed a tool called the Strengths Map. And the Strengths Map, like I alluded to earlier, is built for primarily on that foundation of well-being. We then go into supports, whether you have childcare, transportation, housing. If those areas aren't firm, strong, really developed in a client, you can go up and you can deal with things like certifications and education and go into those financial benchmarks. And what we've seen is time and time again, the client can't maintain that success. That overall foundation of being, that relationship health, emotional health, physical health, if you're not strong in those areas, you can go ahead and invest everything you want to in a client's certification, and they're not going to be able to get a job after that.
So it sounds like accountability is a major part of this. And did you want to say more on that? Or?
Yeah, I do. We've actually got a client that I'll share the story. I think it exemplifies this. Connie came into the Padua pilot in 2015. Typical of most of our clients. She's married mom, 3 kids, woman of color, about 39 years of age, had a bachelor's degree, could not make it from month to month. She was upside down, right? Her expenses were more than her income. And when you got to know Connie, this is the reality of her life. Not only did she have herself, her husband, and her 3 kids, and her husband didn't work. He was an alcoholic, and she was supporting them. She had her mom, her dad, and her brother living with her, and none of them worked. So she was living in a home too big for her to afford. She was part of the Army Reserves and had a full-time job. And like all of our clients, she would come in and she would make success and then lose the job and have to get another job, or she'd save money and then lose the job and spend all that money in there. And this went on for 2.5 years. 2.5 years while the team worked with her to build up that success, to hold her accountable to the goals that she said she wanted, and to keep coming back. And she would come in and she would say, what are you doing for me? I've told you that I need money to pay my rent. And we would come back and say, well, okay, how is that going to move you towards your goal? Show us. And if that can move you towards the goal, we'll put a plan together for it. Well, she couldn't. She stayed there with us. Finally, in January of 2018, she came and she said, I can't live like this anymore. I can't do this. That's the change talk that her team had been waiting to hear. And they said, okay, what are you willing to do about it? She put together a plan to not only have her husband move out of the house to deal with his addiction, but her mom, her dad, and her brother, which was the hardest thing in the world because most of our clients believe that they're accountable. If they get a little bit of money, they have to take care of everybody else. It's very, very hard for a client to hold themselves responsible for their immediate family and not everybody else around them. That was huge for her. She moved into a smaller place between January of 2018 and October of 2018. She got a promotion at work. She was promoted in the Army Reserves. She paid off $6,000 in debt and saved $5,000. She hit those benchmarks, which we consider out of poverty. She moved on, but not only that, she was building up her reservoir of strength and well-being so much that it affected the entire family. Her kids did better in school. Her husband stayed with his program to deal with his addiction, and right now, they've moved to Killeen and they're back together as a family. It works, but it takes a lot of time, and the accountability that you're talking about is huge. We have assessments that we do at the very beginning when clients come in. We have reassessments every 6 months. We have that strengths map that I talked to you about as a client self-report tool. So the client is looking at this and saying, you know, I'm at a place where I could improve, or I'm at a place where I'm thriving. Look where I've come over the past year and a half. And they can see where they're coming from. The way we do our financial assistance, there's an application that they have to fill out to say, okay, this application is saying that I'm going to be using this money to get to this goal, and if I don't hit this goal, what are the repercussions? What's going to happen? There's an interview that then goes along with that. I've done a lot of those interviews with clients, and if the client can't address those questions about accountability, the money's not given. We've given a lot of clients rides to homeless shelters instead of going ahead and paying their rent the next month because there's not a plan in place that's going to allow them to prosper long term.
And I think not only with the accountability, but it's also the personalization and individuality of it. Of, you know, if you go to some other programs or some other, you know, basic welfare services, Cindy, with a very different family makeup and household, gets the exact same services that I would, looking very, very different. Our poverty looks very different. Our situation looks very different, and yet we're treated the exact same. And that's one of the biggest pieces about what we've really tapped into with that executive functioning, that coaching, that accountability, is that the services I need to succeed could look very, very different. And I might not need the exact same support. I could succeed very, very, you know, differently in different methods. And that's really where it comes into when you have that case manager and you have that relationship. It's, you know me and you know what I need to succeed. And we don't have to waste time chasing down a million other things just because that's formality reasons.
Do I have time for one more story? We have another client by the name of Perla who's going to be here in January speaking on one of your panels. And this is completely about that relationship that Shannon was just talking about. Perla came in, married, just had a new baby, had moved here from New Mexico, and her family wasn't here. So when they came in, they were making below a living wage, and the family came in for financial coaching help. How can we handle our bills better? As it came down to it, Perla wasn't working because she couldn't find child care that really she felt comfortable with. So we said, okay, you need to work to bring more money into the household. What are you willing to do? And she said, if you could help me get into a training program and help me with child care. At the beginning, she goes, I'll do this. So there's a 16-week admin program that she wanted to go into. So they said, okay, 4 months of child care. That's a lot. How can we do this? And so she came back and said, well, you know what? I'll go ahead. She goes, if you can pay for the first months of rent. And she put this program together herself. She said, I can pay for the second month and fourth month. So we said, okay, we'll do this one better, because clients completing a 4-month program, it's a lot to expect sometimes. And we said, if you go ahead and you pay the first and third month and you finish the program, we'll reimburse you for the third month that you paid. Not only did she finish that program, found the child care that she wanted, that she felt safe with, so her kid was in a reliable, trusted child care situation. We used our money to reliably get her to help finish out this 14-week program, which, in all honesty, cost us $15 for the program. It was with another agency. She then got a job right afterwards, hit all the benchmarks that Shannon outlined, and then went on and left us and got a job outside of the agency for probably about 12 months. About a year after that, I ran into her downstairs in her lobby, and I'm thinking, off the top of my head, oh, shoot, you're back, right? No, she'd applied for a job at Catholic Charities, didn't come into us for help, was hired with no one knowing she was a client. She now has that job and has been promoted and is one of the biggest proponents. When I went to her and I said, would you be interested in speaking at this public policy panel in January? She said, I don't like getting in front of other people to speak. She goes, let me think about it. She came back to me about a week later and she said, I want to do this. She said, I want people to hear. She said, I don't care if people know I was a client. I want people to know what's possible. And this is for a good cause. And that's the other piece. That's when the accountability wraps all the way back around. People give back.
That's one of the most encouraging things in observing and learning from people who are on the front lines like you has been hearing those stories of lives transformed where they come back and they want to transform others, help others make that same journey. That's a really wonderful story. But Shannon, I don't want to miss over you. Do you want to share some aspects of the transformation that you've seen?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm going to cheat here and give you guys some written down results, but we want to make sure that we get to talk about the lives that we have transformed and just the data that comes with that. As I mentioned in the beginning, one of the biggest questions we had was how can we actually see whether or not we are helping people and making an impact? And so at Catholic Charities, we said, okay, let's research this. Let's actually know it's happening, and let's be able to stand on this with real results. And so in partnership with the University of Notre Dame, we've been able to see that families entering in the Padua program that Cindy has described, when they exit the program and complete, they're at about 125% of the living wage. And so that means that they are able to take care of their families, they are supporting their families, and they're having enough to pay off their debt, put money into savings, and really be able to flourish with all of the things that they want to do and want to achieve. For families that are coming in, we're also working on reducing debt. And so on average, people are able to reduce a little over $2,000 in debt. They're saving about $5,000, which is incredible for people coming in who have never had a checking account before. To be able to say that they're leaving with over $5,000 in their savings account is huge. That means that they're no longer going back to social services, whether it's our agency or somebody else saying that they need assistance. People that are coming in are also leaving with full-time employment. And so 26% of our clients that leave services are at full-time employment. There is a full-time employment increased by 26%. And then families that are coming in that are not currently housed when they enter programs are leaving with a 73% reduction in homelessness. And that's one of our biggest things, is that families are staying together, they are housed, they are safe, and they're able to really work on these goals. And then lastly, and this is probably one of Cindy's favorite things, is we have clients that come in and they use this tool, the self-sufficiency model, and they're able to say that 54% of them have reported an increase in self-reporting of overall well-being, and that includes relationships, that includes stability, that includes health. And that's something that we're really excited to see, of just families are really transforming because of that relationship, because of that case management model. They are growing and really bettering themselves, but also bettering themselves for a future that they want.
And that brings up the last question that I wanted to ask you guys, and I may interject one other if we have time. But this question is about relationships and restoring relationships, and particularly the marriage and family relationship. That's, as I tried to set up at the beginning, there's such a correlation with child poverty and the collapse of marriage. How are you seeing success? You pointed to some already, but can you say more about the restoration of marriage in your work?
When somebody comes to the door and they're stressed about money every day, I think we're all the same way, right? You're stressed out. You're not going to put your best self forward into a marriage or into a relationship with your kid or even society in general. So what we're finding in our work with Padua and case management throughout the agency is that there's a decided shift. The story I told you about Connie, we didn't particularly care if she got back with that husband. I'm going to tell you that from the beginning. He had been an albatross on the family. She cared. And once she could see past the financial hurdles that were in front of her, she went back and she helped repair that marriage. We see this over and over again, not just in marriages, but in your relationship with your kids. We've got one client, Keela, who came back to us and said, I'm a better mother because of the way you've worked with me. I'm taking that home and I'm using that with my kids. When people aren't brought up with the ability to have executive function that ability to parent is difficult. This is a game changer across the board. Just your relationship with society in general changes. You're not expecting necessarily people to do for you, you're expecting you to do with others. So we had a celebration dinner the other night, Tuesday night, so a week ago. And we actually had a client stand up and say, how do I give back? You've done so much for me. This is a client that's been with us for 6 months. What can I do I can help other people? So it is a game changer, and I do think that the relationships and not just the relationship with our staff, but the relationship with others are built stronger because of the work we do in case management.
Shannon, do you want to say anything to wrap that up?
I was just going to add, I think the way that we work with clients, the relationship that they have with their clients, our case managers, it's not just a one-way street. And so our case managers, they are working on restoring themselves as well. We've noticed that as an agency that we expect a lot from our case managers and we expect a lot from our clients, that they know that they're getting the work that we're putting in is the same that they're giving back to us. And so maybe about a year or so ago, we said, we need to have a program that is able to take care of our own people to make sure our side of the street is clean as well. And so we have a very similar program for our own employees who are not financially stable, who are not meeting these benchmarks themselves. And how do we take care of them internally to make sure that they're successful every time that they go meet with a client, that their relationships with their families are stable, they're able to have healthy marriages, they're able to focus on what's going on so that they can really give their all to the clients every day. And we've seen tremendous success in that internally as an agency of just when we take care of it ourselves and make sure that we are prepared and we are fully living our best lives, that we can then help others too.
Well, my first impression of reading you guys' work was holistic, and you've definitely illustrated it there, so thank you. We're going to open it up to the audience now for your questions. These have been fascinating comments already, but a microphone will be coming around, so if you would, raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll be happy to call on you. Yes, sir. Second row here. Can you wait for the mic for the live feed? Thank you. That'll help us be able to have our viewers hear your question as well.
At any one time, how many clients and caseworkers do you have in your organization?
Well, with just individual programs, with the Padua pilot, like right now we have 7 case management teams. And we have about 106, 110 clients. We've capped it with Padua at 25 clients per team. I've got another case management program under me, and we've capped that at 35 clients per case manager. We're still experimenting, we're still learning. The relationship building piece demands that you do not have really high caseloads. So when so many of these agencies are talking about caseloads of 70, it's difficult to establish that relationship piece with a high caseload like that.
Thank you. Yes. Third row at the end. Right on the end there.
Good morning. Is this a model that you've seen interest in expanding to other areas, other organizations that are interested in adopting? And are there any challenges to that type of scaling?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we do with our research and innovation lab that we have in-house is we focus on replication and export. And so we have been partnering with numerous other agencies, whether here in Texas, but also nationally, to replicate and export these solutions. One of the programs that uses a very similar model of case management, but in particular works with community college students, we've actually replicated that to 4 other cities across the nation. And we have Fort Bend, Fort Wayne, Indiana. We have Columbus, Ohio. We have Baltimore, Maryland, and then we also have one in Kansas City. And so we're working really hard to make sure that what we're doing here is not just successful because it's in Tarrant County or in Fort Worth, Texas, but because it's actually a good, real model that's working.
Yeah, we're making you run over here.
Thank you for your presentation. Are there ways in which local houses of worship or lay men and women can become involved with Catholic Charities?
Yeah, we've got a partnership right now with the Methodist Church that they wanted to come in and kind of, in their mind, what they're doing is sponsoring a client. You have to make sure the expectations are set up front. You know, this is such long-term work, and people have asked before if volunteers can do this case management work. I don't think that that's advisable simply because of the clinical nature of it. It's not a clinical program, but all of our case managers are clinically trained. So when the churches come in and want to partner with us, it's really more of a kind of a weekend like cohort activities that we bring them in for. Does that make sense? So they'll come in and maybe it's helping with, you know, children tutoring, or maybe it's helping the moms with, you know, parenting classes, or maybe it's coming in nutrition classes, stuff like that. But to come in on the case management piece, we stay away from that because of the clinical nature of the work. Did that answer it? Okay.
Yeah, right in that same row.
Hi, good morning. I was wondering, would you be willing to share your framework and procedures with other charities?
Yep, so that's one of the things that we're working on right now is packaging specifically the program that Cindy's been sharing about Padua and seeing how do we, you know, make that into almost a how-to guide for other agencies to do this. And so that's something that we really want to see succeed, is that, again, it's not just because something that we have come up with or it's something special about Catholic Charities, but because we really think this particular component here is what makes it successful. And so this is how you could do it too. So that's something we're working on in the near future.
Can I ask a question? I'm going to interject and come back to the audience, but it is striking the degree to which you are thinking about accountability as a provider. Typically, we're talking about accountability for your clients and how that's a part of the relationship. But it's very clear from your presentation that accountability for yourselves is important to you. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you came to that realization, and that's also caused you to have real community care?
That's a really good question. I would say that it comes, that the accountability agency-wide, and then particularly in the department that I work with, that I see this in, it comes from the passion for the work. If you're really driven by what you see is possible, and when you see what you know could happen begin to happen, there is a drive to make sure that you're doing it to the highest extent and the highest quality that you could possibly do that with. There'd be a lot of things that I would tell you about the Padua pilot and our signature case management that's unique to Catholic Charities, and some of the way we do our financial assistance and the way we put together these frameworks. That's unique. But if you look at that clinical approach to case management, it's in any textbook you're going to pick up. What Catholic Charities has given us is the freedom to be able to make it work. They've given us the caseloads. They've given us the ability to plan. But with that, there has to be some accountability and some testing. So the research and evaluation program that Shannon talked about, we have daily dashboards that we look at for our team to see where they're going, not to come back at them and say, hey, you're not meeting your numbers, but then you come back and say, hey, why aren't we meeting our numbers? Are these the numbers we need to meet? Are these the numbers that mean anything for the betterment of the clients in the long term? So we hold ourselves accountable, but it's built out of this passion for the work that we do to make sure that we're doing it the way it should be done.
I'd agree with that. I'd add that, you know, a lot of my job in particular is asking this question of what if or how can we? And so if we look at a program that, you know, is meeting success and it's working, we can always ask the question, well, what else could we do or what could do better? And that's a big part of just seeing then, you know, even internally within programs, we have evaluation teams that are embedded into each program. And again, we think that having that data is just so important, and to be able to say, again, internally, what is working and what is not. And so we have evaluation specialists that sit down with each program and say at the end of the quarter, you know, you were really successful and you hit here, but what if this was just a little bit different? What if we were able to really focus in here on this weakness? And then we can shift focus on that as well. And sometimes that turns into a small, minor programmatic change. And sometimes it leads to a brand new program where we say, you know, this really isn't working. What if we looked at it at a different view? And that's where we've found success internally, especially of just making sure, again, that our side of the street is clean when we go and work with clients, but also as an agency. You know, we talk a lot about a living wage job. That means we have to pay our employees a living wage job, because we can't go out there and expect other businesses to do it when we're not doing it. And that's a big part of it is, again, you know, when we kept saying clients need to be hitting this negative debt, hitting these savings, not relying on government assistance, yet internally we have people that are maybe receiving SNAP benefits. We have to fix that. We have to work on that. We have to hold our own selves accountable for it. So.
Well, what's fascinating about that response is, again, this look beyond the merely material indicators and the fact that it's driven by your passion. Your accountability is driven by your passion for transformation. That is, again, bringing us back to this holistic understanding, even from a provider side. The provider side, a holistic understanding leads to a client side, holistic transformation as well. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, none of this is free, so I'm just curious, what's your annual budget?
Our annual budget is about $43 million.
And you're serving 110, you've got 110?
So that's just one program. So we have about a little over 30 programs total. So.
Okay, okay. But in this particular case that you all are talking about, just a rough idea, what kind of, like the woman that had everybody living with her, about how much resources were spent on her? Just an idea, because it isn't free. This stuff costs money.
It isn't, but doing the financial assistance, the way I talked about, the most that we have ever spent on one client has been right about, and this is over a period of 4 years, was probably around, I don't know, $8,000 to $10,000. Normally it's 3 or under, 4 or under. Where we spend the most money is with transportation. There's another pilot that is under me that we're doing with Uber, providing transportation to work-related places, and that is expensive. That is funded in part by our county government. So that's where I would say most of our expense comes up. You can rack up $3,000 to $4,000 in transportation expenses quickly. But when you're looking at overall case management and rent assistance and what have you, it's really under a few $1,000s a family.
How do you find that your services align or conflict with social workers that may be working with the same clients?
Do you mean working with the same clients from another agency or another benefit program?
Well, I would think that some of your clients may also be working with social workers and attaining services and
from another agency?
Correct. Do you
Yeah, we do.
with them?
We do. You remember when I said a few minutes ago that the client comes to the table and the case management team comes to the table, and it's what can we bring and how do we plan this together and integrate it? We take that same approach when we're working with partners. I would say that when Padua first started, we had a lot more instances of that occurring. Right now, what we're actually doing is we're going out to other agencies and other organizations for referrals into the pilot. So a lot of it is with our independent school districts. And what we're doing is we're working with, say, a social worker in a school. And then they're coming forth and saying, okay, what can we share? What information do we have, the consent signed so that we can share? And how do we use this to really wrap around the services for the client? At no time is any of that done without the client sitting at the table and having just as much concern. I think you had mentioned the word before, dignity, and the dignity of work. All of that comes from the client's ability that they're worth it. They believe that they are worthy of success. They believe that they have as much to bring to that table as any other social worker, case manager that's there. And that's how we take that approach. So most of the time, I've never dealt with another agency or a school district that's had a problem with that approach. It's usually more communication that's needed. And that's the part that's hard because everybody is so past capacity that a lot of times that follow-up on communication is left to us. But it's not because there's a problem with working together. Did that answer that? Okay.
And I'd add in too, it's what we've seen over the year is a request from agencies to partner together. Our program works a lot with people experiencing homelessness or coming from shelters, but we also have a lot of clients, like Cindy said, that are being referred from other agencies who have maybe completed their program and they've gotten to a level of stability, but they know that there's so much more that they can continue reaching, and that's where we can walk in. And so we've really taken it upon ourselves of not duplicating efforts. We don't want to compete with somebody to do the same thing. And so whether that's childcare, instead of creating a childcare program to serve our clients and to solve the childcare issues, why don't we partner with another agency doing that? And then we can work with their, family advocate there or their social worker there and make sure that we're really just adding in more and more benefits to that person's kind of personalized approach.
Well, we started this panel with the premise that the war on poverty approach to fighting poverty has not done justice to the poor, and the status quo is not something we can be satisfied with. It has tried to measure success by handing out dollars and starting new programs, but it has been neglectful of the actual outcomes and whether it is achieving true human flourishing. And this is an explanation of why that perspective is one that we take. You've heard here a wonderful picture of what it means for an organization to hold itself accountable for that holistic flourishing and to do its best to help each individual that it serves and their households to thrive in the fullest of senses. So we're going to transition now to our conversation about education, but please join me in thanking Cindy and Shannon for this picture.
Thank you very much for a very informative panel. We will return for great job.
Thanks for the help with the break.
Oh, no, that's okay. That's all right.
Thank you so much. I learned about Padua
Very close to her on the
yes. Right, so having multiple but simple story oh, where's she? I didn't know.
She's my own boss. Tell her you didn't see me. Tell her I said hi.
Wonderful, by the way. Sort of the same type of goals. We're not nearly as good.
I didn't get a chance to Brad. But so, by the way, this is an awesome approach to, create self-esteem individual.
I would love to come in.
guy say hi? How's he doing? Okay. Okay. Well, welcome back to our second panel, which is titled Uncle Sam Goes to School, The Great Society Education Programs After Half a Century. We have 45 minutes to discuss a topic that could take 45 days. So we'll get right to it. Let me introduce our panel moderator, the Honorable Chuck DeVore, who is the Vice President of National Initiatives here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Chuck?
Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see all of you here. This is really going to be a fun panel. First, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists, and then what we're going to do is launch right into a discussion, and then eventually get to your questions. And I'm sure, looking at the crowd, they're going to be awesome questions. So we have Lindsay Burke. Lindsay is the Director for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. I think a few of you may have heard of that little outfit. It's just a small, little tiny think tank inside the Beltway there. She looks at preschool, K-12 issues, higher education reform, all things that I think we've finished all that stuff, haven't we? It's all done, right? Her commentary, research, and op-eds have appeared in numerous magazines and newspapers. Frequent guest on radio and TV shows, and where, of course, she talks about education reform. I think that one of the more interesting things is that she has a PhD in education policy from George Mason University, where she examined the intersection, that's intersection, not intersectionality, but intersection of education choice and institutional theory. Next, we have Corey DeAngelis. He's the Director of School Choice at the Reason Foundation and an adjunct scholar at Cato Institute. Now, that's very free market, right? I mean, you would think that Reason and Cato might have like a disagreement about sharing somebody, but somehow they've managed to get along and share you, right? That's interesting. I've never seen that before. I've seen people go from one to the other and back, but never at the same time. His research focuses primarily on the effects of school choice programs. And I think we're going to be hearing more about that, the effects of school choice programs, presumably on children and education, right, Corey? I guess more choice is better. We'll have to wait and see what you say. He also received his PhD in education policy. I think you're beginning to see a trend here from the University of Arkansas, and holds a Bachelor of Business Administration and a Master of Arts in Economics from the University of Texas at San Antonio. All right. Exactly. Okay, then we have Dan Lips. He's a visiting fellow at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. He grew up in Connecticut, went to Princeton, where he was a columnist at the Daily Princetonian. Are they still around, or have they been cancel cultured?
They're making it through.
They're making it through so far. Okay. They must not be offensive enough. You have to get back there and encourage them to try harder. So he's worked at a number of think tanks, including Cato and the Heritage Foundation. And he's continued work on this topic as a member of the DC Advisory Committee of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. That was from 2007 to 2012. Again, I think a really fascinating panel. And let's get started. I'll sit down as soon as I ask the launch question, because I don't know how to look graceful and like sit and ask the question. So I'll ask, and then while you're speaking, Lindsay, I'll sit down. So if you look at how did all of this start? In other words, we have this huge amount of federal influence on what used to be entirely a decision made by either parents and or local government, right? And I'm presuming at some point, perhaps around Brown v. Board of Education, the federal government began to take an increasingly large role. So could you walk us through how all of this started?
Well, thanks for that question, Chuck, and thanks again to TPPF for hosting us. It's really just been wonderful and love being here in this beautiful auditorium and in Texas, which incidentally, right now you are sitting just 63 miles away from Stonewall, Texas, which is where there used to be an elementary school called Junction Elementary, which is where Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So we're quite close to where that really kicked off. But to answer your question, I mean, you're right, as Tom Lindsay mentioned earlier, if you crack open your Constitution, and I'm sure you've all read it cover to cover, you will simply not find the word education anywhere in it. It is not an enumerated power of the federal government. So how did we get to the, right there, you can read through it. It's a Cato. We also have heritage guides to the Constitution.
Well,
thank you very much.
Yeah. Theirs was free.
Right. So, but yeah, I mean, if you read it, it's not in there. So how do we get to the point where we have a federal Department of Education with 4,200 employees? How did we get to that point? And so if you look through the history, I mean, you're absolutely right. The federal government had very little involvement whatsoever with education from really the beginning of the Republic until about the mid-20th century. We see little blips here and there. In 1867, we actually got a Department of Education that popped up, but thankfully it was short-lived, only for about a year. It was downgraded a year later to a small little office of education with 4 people in a basement. I don't actually know if they're in a basement, but they were gathering statistics on things like the number of teachers across the country. So very modest. And then you fast forward, still very little federal intervention in education. We get a few things here and there. You see the National School Lunch Program pop up. And then, of course, in 1944, we get the GI Bill, which, of course, at that point, you could argue it has a national security imperative to it, right? We're providing some benefit to returning service members. And so that was fair. And then fast forward a little further, and President Eisenhower comes into office, and something happens in October of '57. Anybody know? Right. The Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite in October of '57. And then a month later, actually just 2 weeks later in November, they launched a second Sputnik satellite. So all of a sudden, you see Eisenhower say, hey, there is an issue. We have to, in his words, best the communists on their own terms. And so you see a little additional federal spending, but it was targeted. It was targeted toward financing some scientists, some mathematicians, and again, you could argue, had a national security imperative. What is fundamentally different about what we're here today to talk about is what President Johnson did. He took the federal government from leveraging it for some targeted, one could argue, national security interests to fighting this Cold War with the Soviets, to fighting a domestic war on poverty at home. And in fact, when he came into office, when Lyndon Johnson came into office in his very first State of the Union address, he proclaimed, quote, "This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America." So this was a seismic shift in how the federal government intervened in education policy. And it launched, of course, the Great Society. What many people aren't aware of is the extent to which the Great Society was involved in education policy. Tom mentioned earlier that we know the Great Society launched things like Medicare and Medicaid and food stamps, but when Johnson launched it, he said 1/3 of the war on poverty would be fought in the classrooms of America. 1/3. There, he said, by the way, your children's minds will be shaped. So we had significant federal intervention starting in 1965. We had the federal government now involved in everything from the federal Head Start pre-K program to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, signed into law 63 miles from here, and the Higher Education Act. So from grade school through grad school, the federal government is now intimately involved. So that's how we got to where we are today. We can talk about outcomes later.
So, Corey, the federal government is well known for really liking choice and variety, aren't they?
Of course, as long as it's what they want you to do. So like Lindsay said, we have had our children's minds shaped, but not in the way that we would like our children's minds to be shaped. That's the only problem. What we've done over the past half century just hasn't worked. Throwing more money at the problem hasn't worked. If you look at per pupil spending in the U.S. over the last half century, we've nearly quadrupled per pupil spending even after adjusting for inflation. And if you look at our nation's report card, outcomes have been consistently flat from year to year. So that hasn't worked. Pre-K hasn't worked. Tacking on one more year to a failing school system hasn't drastically changed anything. In fact, if you look at the most recent random assignment study where they randomly assigned some kids to get pre-K and some kids not to get pre-K, if you look at the most recent study by Mark Lipsey and his team over at Vanderbilt, I think is where he's at right now, they actually found positive effects in the first year, but over time the effects became negative by third grade on student achievement, but also on behavioral outcomes. It actually turns out that if you take kids away from their parents, they become not very good behaviorally. So being with your family has positive effects there. But looking at school choice programs, that's something that actually has worked. Just like Lipsey's study where they randomly assigned some kids to get pre-K or not, we have 16 random assignment studies in the US that randomly assign some kids to get a school choice program, a voucher program, or a tax credit scholarship, and randomly assigns the losers to get to not get the program, so they have to go to the government-run school. So just like a medical trial, we can say that this is the effect of the program and not the effect of the student's background or their family background. We can actually say it's because they got access to the program if we have a large enough sample. So there's 16 of these studies in the US, and 10 of the 16 have found statistically significant positive effects on student test scores. Only one program has found statistically significant negative effects. Does anybody know where that program is located? Yes, thank you, Stephanie Matthews. It's the Louisiana Scholarship Program, which also happens to be one of the most highly regulated school choice programs in the world. They have tons of regulations, including giving up your admissions criteria to the state, having to take the state standardized test, and also having to take the voucher amount as full payment, even if the parent could have afforded, that a $500 co-payment. They'd have to lower their tuition to that voucher amount. And there's a bunch of other, teacher qualification regulations as well. And the regulators, in their infinite wisdom over in Louisiana, have looked at this outcome and said, oh, if only we would have regulated the program a little bit more, we would have gotten positive effects like the other programs. And the remaining studies that use this methodology have found no difference in math or reading test scores. One example finding no difference is the DC voucher program. The most recent evaluation using random assignment was released earlier this year, and the media outlets didn't say much about it because there was no effects on test scores, positive effects on safety, satisfaction, and attendance. It turns out if you really like your school and you're satisfied with it, you actually show up to class each day. Who would have thought? But what's also really interesting about that study is kids in DC using the voucher program on average only received about $9,500 each child. Does anybody want to guess how much the public school students receive each year? You're about right. Yeah, I saw around 28,000, but I guess if you adjust it for inflation, it's around 30,000 in today's dollars. So we got the same test scores and better satisfaction and safety for a third of the cost in the voucher program, but the media typically likes to not talk about that very much or just focus on the no result for test scores. But when you start looking into other types of outcomes of school choice, you find much more positive effects. I already talked a little bit about safety and satisfaction. There's about 30 studies linking school choice to satisfaction, and well, if you get to pick your school, you're more satisfied with the school. All 30 of these studies have found positive effects. I've also done a research on the longest standing voucher program in America, the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, which started in 1990. And we followed the students from the longitudinal evaluation of the program and found that they were about half as likely to commit crimes when they were about 30 years of age. So if you look at the other 5 evaluations linking school choice to crime, we also find large reductions in criminal activity from using school choice. So there's something going on that's not only captured by test scores. So people are choosing schools based on the culture of the schools, the safety of the schools, and how satisfied they are with a slew of different characteristics other than test scores. So I think I should stop talking now. I can talk a little bit more about the other evidence, but I'd also like to talk a little later about how there's a disconnect between effects on test scores and these later life outcomes such as crime and teen pregnancies even.
So Dan, help me out here. So we have a nation where we have increasingly larger numbers of students who don't speak English as their first language, right? We're in a majority-minority state here in Texas. Why shouldn't the federal government be kind of setting the rules to make sure that we have equal opportunity, right? I mean, isn't this what this is all about, is making sure that everybody attends the same mediocre or bad schools together?
That's one way to put it. At the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, we focus on researching and developing public policies to improve economic opportunities for those living on the lower half of the income and wealth spectrum. And I want to congratulate Lindsay and her colleagues on preparing this new book on the not-so-great society. And I largely agree with the view that when we look back to the 1960s, it's been discouraging to see how little progress we've made in improving children's educational opportunities over that time. In some respects, I think that the federal government has played a meaningful and positive role in education, in establishing rights for kids, particularly those that are marginalized, including those with disabilities, as you mentioned, migrants, others who were very poorly served back before the 1960s. Also, by today, we've largely equalized education funding. When you look big picture at the national level, a child who attends, on average, who attends a poor school district will receive similar funding to a child who is in a high-income school district. Yet we haven't seen really in terms of improvement, in terms of outcomes. The NAEP national test scores were released about a month ago, and we saw a continued achievement gap between rich and poor children over the past 50 years. And so in one respect, federal education policy has succeeded, in my view, in establishing that it's the national policy of the United States to prove equal opportunity. If you go back and look at the different purpose statements of all of the laws that have been passed over the past 50 years, they all begin with this premise of equal opportunity. And so I would encourage anyone who's interested in trying to reform federal policy to focus on that value as a starting point to inform our potential reforms to make positive improvements for kids' opportunities.
So let's talk about equal opportunity, Lindsay. I mean, would we even have it if it weren't for the federal government intervening, or are there other ways to have opportunities for our citizens and people who live in the U.S.?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I like to think about the two different paths that were basically unfolding around the same time period. In 1955, Milton Friedman put out his seminal essay, The Role of Government in Education, and in that essay, he first really formalized the idea of separating the financing of education from the delivery of services, making the argument that, yes, just because we have a commitment to publicly fund education, that it does not require government delivery and administration of schooling. So he really first put forward this idea in a formalized way of what ultimately became a school voucher model and tax credit scholarship model, as Corey mentioned. And so to me, it's interesting that we get that essay in 55, and basically we said, let's put that on the shelf. Let's go with the Great Society approach, which was top-down, heavy-handed federal control that really dictates so much of what is taught in local schools across the country today. And unfortunately, we have now half a century of evidence that that approach has utterly failed to help the low-income children in particular that it was designed to help. So if we look at measures like Corey mentioned preschool earlier, the federal Head Start program, this started out as a small summer program in the summer of 1964 in LA. And its goal was to help children access educational options at the pre-K level. But unfortunately, the outcomes of Head Start have been just honestly abysmal. If you look at the outcomes we know from HHS, which by the way administers Head Start, Health and Human Services, not Ed, that we spend about $9 billion a year on Head Start. There are approximately 1 million children and pregnant mothers who are accessing services through Head Start. But the outcomes for these kids, we know from randomized control trial evaluations, Corey walked you through that a second ago, that Head Start has had no impact on parents' parenting practices, children's social emotional well-being, their access to healthcare, their academic outcomes. So unfortunately, it's really failed, and we've spent $240 billion on that program since '65. We can say the same thing about elementary and secondary education outcomes. Dan mentioned the NAEP scores have been completely flat. There's a new evaluation, we talk about it in the book actually, from Eric Hanyashek at Stanford and Paul Peterson at Harvard. And they found that if you go back to '65, the difference in academic outcomes between children in the top and bottom income distributions, so the top and bottom 10% of SES, in 65 was the equivalent of 4 grade levels worth of learning. So for the poorest kids and more affluent kids, 4 grade level difference in learning in 65. Today, there is a 4 grade level difference in learning, which is unfortunate. We have not narrowed that achievement gap, and as Corey mentioned, inflation adjusted, we have quadrupled federal spending. And the last thing I'll say, and then hand it back over, is that the higher education metrics, those give me perhaps the most heartburn at all. I mean, we had, prior to 1965, other than the GI Bill, no federal involvement in the student loan market, as it should be. Again, in 1965, or I'm sorry, in 44 with GI, it was targeted. In 1965, for the first time, we see the federal government providing access to broad-based student loans. And so you had the federal government putting the full faith and credit of Uncle Sam behind private student loans in 65. Unfortunately, it didn't stay there. Today, the federal government originates and services directly 90% of all student loans. And you know the numbers were 1.6 trillion in outstanding student loan debt today. We have 44% of recent college graduates in jobs that do not require a bachelor's degree. So to quote Neil McCluskey from our book, we have created this credential treadmill that has required everyone to run faster just to stay in place. And it has not helped, in particular, low-income students accessing higher ed.
So Corey, $240 billion for Head Start since 1964. Clearly, we needed to spend $500 billion, right? That would have changed things, right?
No, if you look at the most rigorous meta-analysis on the topic, looking at the relationships between spending and student outcomes, it's from 1997, but it's by Stanford University economist Eric Hanischek. It's published in EPA. He looked at nearly 400 studies that tried to determine the effects of spending on outcomes, and he found no systematic difference or effect or relationship between spending and outcomes. So more money hasn't mattered. There have been more recent studies, some published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, that have actually found that if you spend money in the right place in this certain way, that could have a small positive effect on test scores, but that just essentially turns into a tautology. It's a circular reasoning. The people that argue for more funding in public schools will make the argument that, yeah, we've quadrupled per pupil spending over time. Hanischek's meta-analysis found no effects with looking at 400 studies. But if you spend money right, then it'll matter. And so there's a couple of studies that find if you spend it in a certain way, it'll matter. But it's essentially circular reasoning. You can, of course, it's spent right because it matters, and it matters because it's spent right. You can say that about anything. They say the same thing about pre-K as well. Well, if we have high quality pre-K, it'll matter, but looking at Head Start and other programs like the Tennessee program, it hasn't worked, and they can always, the proponents of these policies can always say, well, they just didn't do it right. It wasn't a high quality program. But the fact of the matter is, in general, money isn't spent right, and in general, the pre-K programs are not high quality. So in general, if we just go and increase spending overall, we're not going to find much difference in outcomes.
But can I just say really quickly, one thing though on the Tennessee study, that's what's so interesting is that it was considered the highest quality possible pre-K program. All the proponents said it meets this 10, gold star, whatever, low student-teacher ratio. And so even the high quality programs, we have struggled to get outcomes.
And then they could just pivot and say, oh, we were wrong. It actually wasn't high quality because we didn't find a positive effect. You see how that works? Yeah, so
it didn't work because it didn't work.
Yeah, see, it's circular reasoning. You can say that about anything, but the fact of the matter is that the policy that has worked is school choice. If you don't just cherry pick studies, you look at all the studies, they happen to be positive overall. And yet we still force kids to be in one geographically assigned school based on their zip code.
I'd like to ask Dan, and then others can weigh in on this. Why is this so hard? So for example, I'm saw the light, moved from California to Texas, but before I saw the light, when I was living in darkness, I was a state assemblyman in California. And one of the things that happened in California was you saw the growth of the charter school movement there. California was an early adopter, largely because there was widespread dissatisfaction with the public schools in California. Now, though, we're seeing every legislative session additional statute passed to put charter schools in California under the same burden that the traditional public schools have, such that now it's hard to tell the difference. So as they've leveled, the distinctions, why does that happen? Why is this so hard?
I think that there's a lot of politics in play, and an unspoken challenge we face is the political interest groups that affect what should otherwise be debates about kids at all levels. You mentioned the state level. I spent the past 8 years before joining FREOP working as a committee staffer in the United States Senate for the Senate Homeland Security Committee. And in Washington, one of the lessons I learned was that to enact reforms and to try and make any positive difference, you really have to, one, confront the challenges you'll face, which are these political groups, but also to try and find areas of agreement and around common values that can be shared by both the right and the left. And when we're trying to address challenges like reforming an approach to federal education policy that hasn't worked for 55 years, I think it behooves us to think about where there is common ground, because if we don't do so, we will not achieve any meaningful reform in Washington. And in my opinion, that starts by looking at equal opportunity, which is a shared value, and trying to take each of the programs that we've been talking about today and to look at where there may be common interests, to reform them in a way that helps parents and their kids. Lindsay mentioned the Head Start program. That's has this long-standing disappointing record of spending about 10 grand per kid. The kids who end up in Head Start are no better off than children who don't benefit from this program. It's interesting. I think there's actually a chance to reform that program where both the left and the right may see common ground. The Obama administration actually tried to reform it from the inside, trying to expand the number of hours that are available. From right now, Head Start only provides 400 hours of treatment per year, versus a traditional public school that's about 1,000 hours. So if you put yourself in the perspective of the families that are served by these programs, that's a lot of benefit of childcare. It could be valuable preschool and learning instruction for the child. To the left, in ideal circumstance, they'd have this goal of expanding Head Start to make it more valuable. For the right, we're interested in expanding choice. I think there could be a matchup there under the banner of equal opportunity to find common ground.
Corey, why is this so hard?
Well, I wanted to comment a little bit about the regulation. I mean, if you can't beat them, you regulate them, right? And Lindsay wrote her whole dissertation on this idea that regulations could homogenize the market for education. And so you can essentially turn the private schools, which are specialized, to government-run schools. They start to look the same over time. They start to identify as less specialized. They start teaching to the test because that's their new metric of success. So I think that's a huge problem, and it led to a lot of the problems in Louisiana. Lindsay and I have done a lot of research on this. Only about 1 in every 3 private schools in Louisiana actually accepted the offer to participate in the voucher program. In other locations in the U.S., the participation rate is either double or higher than double that participation rate, around 60 to 70%, rather than the 33%. So if you can't beat them, you regulate them and turn the private schools into public schools that do participate in the programs. We've also found that these regulations have started to homogenize the sector. And if you don't have meaningful options, that's not really a meaningful choice, and we shouldn't expect those types of programs to work very well.
Lindsay, what are the roadblocks to reform?
Yeah, I think Dan hit it earlier on the special interest side. I mean, something like Head Start, even reforming from within is difficult. Head Start employs about 260,000 adults in the program, and so there is that inherent sort of tension when it comes to trying to improve outcomes. But there is a path forward for Head Start, I think, which is, allow those dollars to be portable. Part of the reason it's not working well for families is because you have low-income families who end up dependent on a distant federal program that isn't responsive to their needs, it's not locally driven. So thinking about, could we make those dollars portable, instead follow children to a private provider of choice that can meet their needs, and then applying that same idea to other federal options that are out there right now, things like the Individuals with Disability Act. We've put forward the idea of creating micro education savings accounts with those existing dollars, micro because it would only be about $1,100 a year for the family, but giving them the ability to find special education services and providers that meet their needs. One just quick note of caution though, we have to be really careful at the federal level even about advancing really solid policies like school choice. It's important to remember, despite all of this intervention that we've covered, the federal government, blissfully, is still just an 8.5% stakeholder in all education financing. So it's still, massively state and locally funded. It's about 45 state versus local revenue sources across the country. So if we want to advance choice-based options, it really has to happen at the local level, both because that's where the funding is, for reasons of good governance, constitutionality, et cetera.
I think the obvious roadblock is the teachers' unions. The competition, they want to stifle their competition, which is the private schools and the charter schools. Really, school choice should be a bipartisan issue. The left should like it because it leads to more educational opportunities for poor people. Rich people can already send their kids to private schools. The right should like it because it leads to more competition and it saves taxpayer money at the same time and leads to better outcomes. So it really should be a bipartisan issue, but I think we have special interests being put forth before special needs.
But you've had no problem advancing school choice in Texas.
None, that's right.
Yeah, they have charter schools.
So we have now, this is your time for questions and answers. We have 15 minutes. What I'd like you to do, if you have a question, we have a microphone that will eventually link up with you. Please state your name. If you're with an organization, say what that is, and then ask a question. Please resist the temptation to give a speech. So anyway, yes, in the back here. Thank you.
Hi, this is
Doug and Flanagan, and I have written papers on school choice and on environmental education, some for Texas Public Policy Foundation. We talk about the unions. In 1960, the AFT had 59,000 members. In 1970, it had 200,000 members. Today, 1.7 million members. The NEA, that's what I'm saying. That's better. That's way better. Yeah, okay, we'll go back. 59,000 members of the AFT in 1960, 200,000 in 1970, 1.7 million today. The NEA, that was the AFT. NEA, 765,000 in 1960, 3 million today. That's 5 million union teacher jobs. And it's not just that they're getting nice salaries. The unions themselves promote a social fabric that is the dominating factor in American education today, that is much more important to them than math and science. If we want to change education, we have to attack the source. And it's a simple thing. That power is they don't judge outcomes the same way we judge outcomes.
So is your question, how do we curtail the power of the unions?
How do we refocus education on math and science and reading and writing and things like that, the classical education that we always had, as compared to what they're teaching today, which is, well, you can imagine what it's all out there. I don't need to talk about it. The focus of education today is on transforming society to fit the government top-down mode.
Has anyone in here checked out the NEA website? They put all of their items that they vote on and what was passed and what was defeated. One of the recent items was something about let's make education about the kids again, make it student-centered. It wasn't passed. It was defeated. And so what you're saying is just right up there for everybody to see on their website. But I think one way to reduce that trend of inclining teachers union influence and enrollment, I think it's already happened with the Janus decision. You can opt out or you can opt out of union membership if you don't want to be in it. So I think that could cause a different trend in the future. So I think a lot of state-based organizations are actually reaching out to teachers and saying, hey, you don't have to be in the union. You can get your money back if they're not pushing for the policies you actually like. And the union has a bad track record on this. If you look at Ben Scafferty's work from Kennesaw State University, he wrote a couple of articles called Back to the Staffing Surge. And he found that from 1992 or 1994 to 2014, per pupil spending in the US actually increased by 27%, and this is after adjusting for inflation, but teacher salaries actually dropped by 2%. So the union actually isn't bargaining for increasing teacher salaries. They're bargaining for just having more people, which benefits them because of more votes and then more political influence and yeah, and more dues, obviously. So I think the Janus decision might change that trend going forward. But looking back, it's been more money. Teachers aren't seeing any of it. So the teachers shouldn't be striking against school choice. They should be striking against the unions.
Yeah, and I was going to say a lot of what Corey just said on the Janus decision. At this point, though, it is sort of a civil society requirement, right? At this point, it needs to be localities, it needs to be states informing teachers of their right to no longer join the union and doing something that North Carolina considered, which was, so if you talk to teachers and you ask them, why do you join the union? They give one answer more than any other answer, which is liability insurance. And so North Carolina, it didn't pass, but something they considered a few years ago was having the state provide public education employees with an alternative insurance option. That's how you sort of undercut some of the union special interests. And the last thing I'll say really quickly, Corey's other point on the staffing surge, I think it's fascinating. If you go back to 65, you fast forward, there's been about a 40% increase overall in student enrollment in public schools across the country. There's been a 137% increase in non-teaching staff. And so Paul Peterson at Harvard makes the argument that this has come at the expense of increased teacher salaries because it's just more and more non-teaching bloat that we see.
Question down front.
Thank you, sir. Corey, my question's for you. Paul Ivy, self-employed. My understanding is that a lot of the Democratic presidential candidates are very pro-public school choice. Do you have any thoughts on some of those?
This is a softball question, isn't it? Warren's come out strong against school choice, so has Bernie Sanders, but Warren's been really recently in her education plan. She called to ban for-profit charters. She called to make it more difficult to authorize new charters. And she's taken a firm stance against private school choice as well in her education plan. But she actually taught at UT Austin and sent her own kid to a private school, Kirby Hall School. It's pretty close, right down the road. I think the current tuition is around $18,000.
Wait a minute, did you have something to do with uncovering that?
Yeah, and I think this is why the question was asked. But essentially, Warren was coming out, #PublicSchoolProud, all over Twitter. She wouldn't shut up about ending privatization in education. And Education Week had sent her a few inquiries asking if, where did you go to school and where'd your kids go to school? She answered the question about where she went to school. I went to a public school in Oklahoma. I'm so public school proud. But she didn't respond to the inquiries about private school, and nobody had figured this out yet. So I went on Ancestry.com and looked up Alex Warren, her son, and her daughter, Amelia Warren. Turns out Amelia went to Brown University, an Ivy League school. And in high school, at least, she went to a public school here in Austin. I think it was called Anderson High School. But in the same year, she sent one kid to public and one kid to private. That's just proof of the need for school choice, that one size doesn't fit all. And she had that option for her kids, but she wants to deny that same option to poor kids.
And we'll move over to the other side after.
Hi. So, thank you for being here today. So my background is in social work, and I've worked with young people experiencing homelessness, victims of domestic violence. And I think that one of the things that I haven't heard you speak a lot about today is some of the other kind of external factors that might be impacting. And I know that you mentioned that it was a randomized test, but I think that there's still something important to recognize, the impact of generational poverty, generational trauma, and systemic racism as it exists and how that's impacting our school systems. So I'd love to hear you speak a little bit about what you found in your research.
I can talk to a little bit of the research pertaining to that question. So yes, the random assignment studies net all that out, but that, what else besides school choice should we be talking about as well? And one of the big things is single parent households. In our Milwaukee study, one of our controls we used was whether or not you grew up in a single parent household, and that was also significantly related to criminal activity much later on in life. And it also turns out in that same study, we found that the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program reduced paternity suits by 38%, and those are often caused by teen pregnancies. So for their kids, they could also be reducing crime as well, since the program is reducing crime for the participants, but also reducing paternity suits and teen pregnancies for the participants as well. Their children may be benefiting down the line as well by having them grow up in a two-parent household. That could be part of it. And I think there's only 4 studies that have linked, that have any rigor, that have linked school choice, either charter schools or private school choice, to teen pregnancies. And another one of charter schools in New York City found a 59% reduction in teen pregnancies as well.
Dan, why is school choice tied up with equal opportunity?
Well, I think that it's a core value that a family should have the ability to choose the best school for their children. And one of the really promising developments that we've seen over the past few decades is the development of choice programs that benefits children that face really difficult life circumstances. Since the early 2000s, there's been a development of trying to use choice programs, either vouchers or charter schools, to serve children in foster care who suffer in really incredible challenges, including frequent home placements, instability. There's now programs at the state level to try and harness choice to help them. There's great promising programs that have been made to offer better choices for children who are served with disabilities, to have a new outlet beyond the traditional school system. If we're really trying to change this long-term trajectory of federal programs not working, it behooves us to look at where there may be common ground on the right and the left. And I think that's focusing on trying to transform these broken top-down programs to offer more choice, particularly at audiences and groups of children that really need help. And I think that's, we've seen some development, but not enough.
Question over here on this side. Yes, in the middle, right here. Stretch that arm. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for being here. I just wanted to ask you, from the launch of the Great Society that has, put themselves in the education area that they don't necessarily belong, how has the academia, the instructors, the teachers, how have they gone so far from right to left, and the percent? Do you have is there any data points on where they were back in '65 to where they are? I mean, I know it's like a 95% of the people, the professors in college are very left-leaning. Is there any way to answer that?
I'll say one quick thing. I don't know longitudinally. You might know some longitudinal data, but I know if you look at Education Week, which is sort of an industry education journal, they did some polling maybe a year or two ago on the political leanings of teachers in public schools across the country, and kind of surprisingly, it was fairly even. It was about a third that identified conservative, liberal, and then independent.
But are the independents Marxist or are they libertarians? That's the question. But yeah, it's worse in the university system. I don't know the data over time and if it's shifted left or shifted right. I couldn't tell you about that, but it also differs by the type of field as well, right? So education's pretty bad. It's like when I get peer reviewers, I want to say it's 99% against me, but I don't know the actual stat on that. But like economics, it's a little better. It's 3 to 5 Republican to Democrat ratio in economics, but the humanities, history, education, it's much more heavily skewed. I think the National Association of Scholars did an estimate that overall it was maybe 16 to 1 or 10 to 1. It was pretty heavily skewed, and I don't know what explains that, but I think it has something to do with kind of this elitist thought that I'm so smart I can control society by just telling everybody else what to do, and I think that tends to be a left-leaning trait more so than a right-leaning
really
trait.
works at home with my 2 daughters. In the back.
Thank you, and thanks for this panel. Just one comment, and you guys have presented a lot of good information, but I think this would have been a better panel with a 5th chair, someone who supported public education, public schools, and get a more diverse viewpoint for everything that's going on.
Well, and I would say on that, so we do support public education. I think part of what we're arguing is that we need to reconceptualize what we mean by public education. It gets back to what I said at the top, which was, yes, of course, publicly financed, but separate the financing from the delivery of services. So I've just made it my mission to have people reconceive of what we mean by that very definition of public education.
And the evidence is pretty clear that school choice leads to improvements in the public schools too. So if you really care about the kids in the public schools, you should give them more competition. There's 27 studies on this. 25 of them find statistically significant positive effects of school choice competition on the traditional public schools as well.
And by competition, just to be clear, and we're near the end, as I recall, those studies are agnostic as to the type of choice. In other words, you can have inter-district transfers, intra-district transfers, charter schools, which are of course public schools. Anytime you have choice, regardless of whether it's with a private school or not, you improve the traditional public school system, correct?
Yeah, a lot of studies have looked at different types of choice. Some are a little bigger competitive effects as well, but no types of choice have found negative effects of competition, which is what is often claimed, that the kids left behind will be worse off. But
so we're at the end of our Q&A portion. That went really fast. I think it was pretty fun. I think that this is certainly an area that we need to pay a lot of attention to. There's a lot of moving parts, and to me, one of the more interesting developments here locally is that in the greater Austin area, just in the last 10 years, you've seen the market penetration of charter schools go from 2 or 3%, such that now they're I think pushing past 8% in the region. And what has happened to those traditional public schools in the last decade? Well, what you're starting to see is superintendents, especially outside of Austin, are creating early college, high schools. They're creating language academies, fine arts academies, STEM academies, because of the concern that if they don't, they're going to lose market share to some of these charter schools. So you are already beginning to see that effect locally in Austin, and I think it's going to start to manifest itself in improved educational outcomes, if it hasn't already. So with that, thank you so much for attending, and that wraps up this specific panel. We'll pass it back over to Dr. Tom Lindsay.
Thank you, Chuck, and our panelists. We will go out for lunch, which is out there on the table. We'll be back at 11:45. You can bring your box lunch in and sit here if that's what you prefer. See you in 15 minutes. Good job. Appreciate that. As always, very professional, Chuck. Thank you, sir. Get the hell out of my way. All right, we're back. I hope your lunch is satisfactory. Please continue to enjoy it here as I introduce our last but certainly not least panel titled Great Hearts Are What Make a Great Society. Let me tell you a little bit about our panelists here before I sit down to ask them questions. We begin with Robert Jackson here to my immediate left. Robert Jackson is the Chief Academic Officer of Great Hearts America, and he is the founding director of the Institute for Classical Education. For a dozen years, he served as a professor of English and education at the King's College in New York, training future teachers in the rudiments of education, history, and philosophy. And since I'm introducing Robert right now, let me take this instance here to point you to Sunday's Dallas Morning News, which ran a wonderful and true story about Great Hearts, titled Great Hearts Charter Schools Are Making Waves by Serving Mostly Middle-Class Families. I recommend the article. And congratulations, Robert. Next, we have Emily Sass. Emily is the Senior Policy Director for our Texas Public Policy Foundation's Center for Innovation and Education. Before coming to the foundation, Emily served as Senator Ted Cruz's state staff as Deputy Regional Director for North Texas, as the Senator's liaison on all policy topics to a 14-county region. Thank you, Emily. And then on the far left there, only geographically, we have Andrew Guillen. Andrew is the Senior Policy Analyst here at the TPPF Center for Innovation and Education. He's also an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins. Prior to joining TPPF, Andrew spent 10 years at nonprofit and philanthropic organizations researching and trying to improve higher education. Please join me in welcoming our three panelists. And before I sit down to ask questions, I just want another reminder here. This wonderful text was mentioned at the last panel. I recommend it to all of you. It is an analysis of the Great Society programs titled The Not So Great Society. When I read through this, it struck me as the 2019 version of Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. Right? Lindsay Burke is the lead author of this text. Right? I recommend it to all of you. All right. Let's begin with Robert. Robert, why don't you tell the audience some of the underlying reasons that families today are increasingly choosing a classical K-12 education?
Sure. Well, to begin with, let me celebrate the countercultural move that you're making this morning, even as you're eating your lunch there. As you probably know, Chick-fil-A has been under fire as of late for having taken a stand and embraced its own convictions as a corporation, though that may be wavering at the moment. There's a sense in which families who choose Chick-fil-A and families who choose choice, educational choice, charter schools, are in fact exercising their right. As was said earlier, there is this sense in which equal opportunity is at the heart of our work. That if we are to promote schools, truly schools with excellence in the center, at the very center of the work, we'll do so because families are asking for, perhaps even demanding them. So the characteristics of the types of schools that I work with at Great Hearts Academies, and there are hundreds of private and public charter schools like our own that embrace what we often refer to as a classical model. That model really is reliant on perennial texts, great texts, things like Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Ethics. We begin with the Greeks because that's where our civilization began. And we walk it through all the way down to the American experience. As many of you know, the founders were almost enraptured by the Roman Republic as they attempted, of course, to create their own understanding in the modern era. And I think families recognize the value of a return to sources and to authority, to acknowledge that our past, our traditions are still alive in as much as we revitalize them generation after generation. So we read great text, but let's be clear, you can always pull a great text off of the shelf. What you do with that in a classroom is essential. And what we do is take every opportunity we can to engage students in a conversation. That is to say, to understand arguments that are presented to them. And it does begin very much in the American experience. We read not only that Constitution that the Honorable Judge had with him, but we read the Federalist Papers to explore the types of debates that were required, the types of challenges that were issued, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and ultimately were resolved in the compromise, the political understanding that this people, we the people, could produce this more perfect union. That is the conversation that we want students to have. And I think families are really attracted to that. They recognize that if our children are going to be prepared to take on the challenges of this present moment, they need to know where they've come from. They need to know their roots, if you will. They need to put those tap roots deep. And then they need to think through those issues as they're lived out in this contemporary moment. The other thing that I would mention, and I think is important, and it shows up in the Dallas Morning News piece, there is a sense in which beauty permeates our schools. And I don't just mean the art on the walls, though that is, they're replete with art, but much of that's student art that is in fact designed to reproduce, because students have acquired skills of technique, skills of observation, skills of recognizing a form and then reproducing it. Much of the art in our schools, the music in our schools, the drama, the poetry that is to be found throughout the curriculum is in fact reproduction. It's, the Greeks called it poesis. It's making. So students are making something of the tradition that they've been handed. And as such, they're imitating masters. So families see this, they're attracted to it, and when I first arrived at Great Hearts 6 years ago, I came from the professorate. I was just enthralled with sending my students, as they graduated, to go and teach at Great Hearts. They were serving 7,000 students in Phoenix. Today, having come into Texas 4 years ago, we now serve 19,000 students and have an equal number of students on wait lists. So families want something more, and we feel like it's an opportunity they deserve.
Thank you, Robert. Emily Sass, the Heritage Foundation's book, The Not So Great Society, says, quote, "We need to turn from the Great Society back to the solutions created by civil society," unquote. How is Texas doing that?
Thanks for the question, Tom. I'm thrilled that I get to be sort of the optimist on the optimistic panel about what's going well and what we can encourage and move forward in our society in America today. Texas honestly has a lot to be excited about. There's a lot of room to grow, but we have made some progress, and in some areas the environment's right to continue that growth of options created by society, by the civic society, not the government, for parents and students to take advantage of and to choose as something that they want to buy into, kind of like you just heard about Great Hearts and their classical model. It's something that parents sense a connection with and want to buy into, and their families to be a part of. We're just gonna run through a couple of numbers. There are, by the last Census Bureau estimate, about 6 million children in the state of Texas between the ages of 5 and 18. About 5.1 of those are educated in traditional district schools. About 300,000 of those students are educated in public charter schools, the same model that Great Hearts uses to come to Texas. About 250,000 are educated in private schools that have been created to serve families where they are. About 350,000 of those students are educated at home in a homeschool environment of some kind. And the great news is those numbers are growing. We're still looking at options that have been created on the margins of a larger public system that's dominated the landscape for a long time. But in Texas, the opportunity for charters to grow, once it's kind of hard to get a charter as it is in most states, but once you have it, the opportunity for growth is huge. And you can see the rapid expansion of Great Hearts that Robert was just mentioning. Homeschooling, Texas is one of the best states in the nation for homeschoolers. In other states, you have to somehow receive a certification or prove that you're worthy to educate your children in your home. In Texas, the assumption is that a parent is a fit person to educate their child, and they can choose to do so should they want to. So it's a great environment for families to pursue the education that they want, whether that is through a charter, private, or home environment. There's obviously some work to do. It should be easier to get a charter in Texas for qualified applicants than it is right now. I'm sure Robert has stories of the application process to get here in Texas in the first place. And of course, we have no private school choice program where the government actually frees up education dollars that are paid by taxpayers for families to use and send to the school of their choice, which is one of the reasons that these options are still limited in their capacity. But they are growing in spite of that, and that is room for optimism. So I'm excited about where we are today, Tom.
Thank you, Emily. As I mentioned, Andrew Gillen is an expert in higher education economics. Andrew, looking at the Heritage Not So Great Society book, what do you find to be the most important insights regarding higher education?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I want to congratulate Lindsay for including higher education in these conversations, because oftentimes higher education is kind of an afterthought. And I think there's about 5 or 6 chapters that focus specifically on higher education. And I kind of jotted down some notes here about some of the common themes that were running through those chapters. And the first one was that the kind of increase in government involvement in higher education has really had some unintended consequences, and a lot of those are pretty negative consequences. So the first one is that we've seen that a lot of the federal financial aid programs actually increase the cost of colleges. And this has really been a new revelation to a lot of people, but conservatives have been saying this since about the late 1980s. But the rest of the academic community has really come on board, and there's much less controversy about this point at this point. Really, the only organizations that still contest this are advocacy-based organizations that just haven't kept up with the research literature. And so this is a point that the book is very clear on. It documents it very well. It does a very good job on that. The second point is that a lot of universities are now abandoning their traditional mission. And so if you think about the purpose of a university, to a large extent, it's the production, the preservation, and the dissemination of knowledge. And unfortunately, a lot of universities or maybe at this point programs within those universities are starting to abandon that, and they're prioritizing social justice advocacy over the pursuit of truth. And if this is isolated to 1 or 2 programs, maybe it's not that dangerous. But the danger, of course, is that it kind of grows and infects the rest of the campus. One of the, I was reading a paper on the flight on the way down here, and it was by FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And they were documenting the kind of growth of bias response teams on campuses. And these are essentially teams that a lot of campuses have, a lot of colleges have, where you can report instances of bias. And that sounds great when you think of, you're discriminating against this woman, or you're discriminating against this Native American or something like that. But they go well beyond that. And so a lot of them will actually include just political statements that people disagree with. You can report these to these bias response teams. And there's several hundred of these teams in existence, and about 3 million students are attending colleges with these teams. And so this is really where the danger of kind of universities moving away from their traditional mission lies. A third point that a lot of the chapters picked up on was that you've got a lot of consequences from the increase in subsidization of higher education, you've of course got more students going to college, and several of them are actually graduating. And so the increase in demand and the increase in supply of college graduates has a number of knock-on effects. So the first effect that they do a really good job of talking about is kind of grade inflation. And so as you increase the number of students going to college, many of them aren't as prepared for college level work, and that puts a lot of pressure on universities to start kind of not making a C be the average grade anymore. The program I teach in is a perfect example of that. If you actually get 2 C's, we kick you out of the program. And so, of course, the average grade is not a C, because I don't want the average student in my class to fail. So the average grade in my courses is a B+. And so we've kind of just institutionalized grade inflation to a large extent. Another kind of consequence of the increase in demand, increase in supply, is something that Lindsay already mentioned, which is Neil's great trademark here. I hope he trademarked it. If he hasn't, maybe I'll beat him to it, of the credential treadmill. So a lot of jobs now are requiring credentials that they just did not require in the past. And this is a problem because education is very costly. People are devoting a lot of resources to going to college. And so if those credentials aren't actually necessary for the job they have, this represents a lot of wasted time and effort and resources. And then a third impact of the increase in supply and demand is kind of the phenomenon of underemployment. And this is a little bit related to the credential treadmill, but it's the idea that college graduates are taking a lot of jobs that don't even require a college degree anymore. And so the numbers on this are truly shocking. So about 40% of recent college graduates are now what we would consider underemployed, where they don't actually need a college degree for the job they have. And then the fourth and final major point that I think the chapters do a really good job of touching on is the combination of the lack of accountability for public funding, combined with the empowerment of this like quasi-regulatory accreditation cartel, for lack of a better word. And so if you haven't heard of accreditation in higher education, it's this very strange phenomenon. But we've basically empowered a number of private regional monopolies to basically have governmental regulatory authority over colleges. And so it's like, if that sounds strange, it is, and that's an accurate description. And so the chapters do a great job of explaining the problems with that.
Thank you, Andrew. Just to add one detail, Andrew mentioned grade inflation. In the early 1960s, 15% of all college grades given nationwide were A's. That's 15%. Today, across the country, an A is the most common grade given in college. 45% of all college grades across the country are A's. 75% are A's or B's. For this reason, employers have been telling me for 20 years, we barely even look at transcripts. They're all A's and B's. Right? Okay. Back to Robert. Robert, I want to get a chance here to help the audience learn a few more details about your noble project. Would you tell us what distinguishes a classical charter school from a typical charter school or from a district school?
Sure. Well, as was said in a previous panel, the advent of charters in the early 90s provided private citizens and organizations to step forward and contract with the states, right, to fulfill the educational mission of training the next generation of K-12 schools in particular. And this began in Minnesota, shortly thereafter California and Arizona. And so the distinctives of a classical charter school is simply building upon, first of all, the law that permits, again, private individuals or organizations to get involved in and provide public education, public monies, state monies that are given to that organization. But I would want to add here, and you can read some more of the fine print, the details, if you will. If you do take a copy of the book, my chapter focuses on the intersection, not sectionality, the intersection, right, of homeschooling families, the likes of which Emily mentioned, who themselves were rediscovering a traditional reading of education, private schools, many of them with religious convictions and framework, who themselves were essentially the seedbed for what would become charter schools. So just very briefly, the Great Hearts schools that now number 30 were essentially given birth in Tempe, Arizona by a group of professors and families. The community itself was rising up saying, we need better. They had found a private school near South Bend, Indiana, and said, we want to bring that model to Tempe, Arizona. They couldn't at the time afford it, couldn't sort of make the business model work, and coincidentally, propitiously, charter laws were being passed. So they took that private model, which had kind of a religious orientation, stripped it of catechesis, right, and all of the religious elements, and offered up what was effectively a classical model. So I mentioned this, again, the intersection of these forces, because families that were interested in reading great books and were interested in a continuity of a tradition from the Greeks down to our present day, families gave birth to the charters that we now call classical. And by the way, for my money, I'm not devoted to classical as such. I mean, it is. I know that because it stems back to the classical period. I would love to see our public schools, district schools nationwide, adopt elements of our work, namely that there are great texts, there is great conversation, and ultimately there's a virtuous community that's being formed. The kind of friendships that Aristotle spoke of, where together we are pursuing excellence, we are pursuing a greater good, and the common good benefits, right? I think it's very important to understand that classical charters understand that we have to prepare the next generation not only to be able to read well and to think clearly, but to make a contribution in their moment. Again, civic duties and civic virtue is at the heart of classical education. But again, if classical just drops off in the next 50 years and we just continue to do what we're doing, I'll be fine with that.
Thank you, Robert. Emily, we've talked a little bit about homeschooling. Could you give the audience a little more information on the homeschooling movement? Specifically, how has it evolved over the past several decades?
Yeah. So homeschooling is as old as the American founding and even older than that. It used to be in America one of the primary methods of delivering education to children, especially in the states where land holdings were larger and it was harder to get to school or you didn't have a school close to you. Your family was your school. In fact, I was doing a quick, somewhat informal review before this just to check my memory. And from a quick search, between 6 and 9, depending on how you're looking at their educational structure, between 6 and 9 of the first 10 presidents of the United States had at least some or the majority of their education provided to them in a home-based environment. And I say that not to say that homeschooling is the best way to educate your children, look at how many presidents there are, but to point out that this was a common method in those days, and most of these home-educated presidents went straight from that sort of environment to the schools that we would be most enthusiastic about sending an academically thriving student to in our day, i.e. Harvard, and some of the other schools that were leaders at that time as well as now. So it kind of dropped off. Actually, for a while, there was a push in American society to try to ban privately educating children, whether in the home or in a private school. That was actually ended in the early 1900s by the U.S. Supreme Court, which confirmed that yes, parents do have the right to direct the education of their children, and that includes private options should they choose them. And after that point, there slowly became a resurgence that really picked up around the 80s, and we've seen it grow since then as families were feeling uncomfortable with what they were being offered and realized that there was something else that they could provide for their families. Back in the 80s in Texas, we had a series of court cases which resulted in the freedoms for homeschoolers that we have today, where their freedom to homeschool remains relatively unchallenged due to some great advocacy work on the part of the Texas Homeschool Coalition and others. What this means is homeschooling, and Carrie McDonald, by the way, has done a great job, of Cato Institute, has done a great job of encapsulating this in the book, should you choose to pick up a copy, as Tom said. But it's become an engine of innovation because there are no written rules. Homeschooling is whatever it needs to be for your family. It just happens in your home, usually, but not always anymore. So what we're seeing is parents, we think of homeschooling today as Mom stays home and teaches children. And if that works for a family, I highly recommend it. I can tell you from personal experience, because that's the model my parents chose, that that is an excellent way to receive an education. But it doesn't work for all families. So parents started banding together and creating these things called co-ops, where they shared the educational, the teaching burden for their students, and organized field trips and excursions to go together. Now, that still wasn't the right option for some families, so they've started creating things such as micro schools. They're, again, as old as the country. There were dame schools back in the early days of America, where you went to the house of the lady down the street who was particularly good at teaching, perhaps, and you learned in her kitchen with your other neighbor children in a what we would call a homeschooling environment today. So a micro school kind of adopts that model, where say you have a teacher, someone who's experienced in their field, often somebody who's certified, but it's a small group of students, so you can have that individualized instruction. Your parents are very involved. Sometimes you're only there a couple of days a week, and then you're back with your parents the rest of the week. They're creating these hybrid models that are extremely customized to the needs and desires of families, and that are becoming more and more adaptable to families' lives and schedules. In fact, there's one here in Austin called the Numbers Lab, which offers either a full curriculum, should you choose it, like a private school, if you will, or you can just select certain classes that for some reason, mom or dad don't want to cover, or they want the child to take in a social setting with other students, and you can just take those classes. And this burst of innovation in homeschooling is creating new models across the country. You're seeing virtual schools reach out to these students and these models. And they're creating virtual charter schools now to reach to a larger audience as well. And of course, Great Hearts itself came out of the homeschool movement, as you were just hearing. So homeschooling, because it is so unregulated and so open and free, you can see how innovation is just spiraling out of it. And we'd love to see that sort of deregulation happen in larger areas of the U.S. Education sector, in order to allow that same kind of rapid innovation in other areas as well.
Thank you, Emily. Andrew, based on the research in Heritage's The Not So Great Society, do you find any lessons for K-12 education from the last 55 years of our experience with higher education?
So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned, both for K-12 from higher ed and for higher ed from K-12. So when you look at higher education, it's actually got, at the federal level at least, it's got a funding follows the student model. So if you look at the Pell Grant and student loans, students can take those to any college they want to. And so this is often something we're pushing for at the K-12 level. And at the higher education level, you also have immense competition. And so there's about 4,000 degree granting institutions. Students can go to any of these. And so you've got a lot of the things that we're pushing for at the K-12 level already in place in higher education, in the form of funding follows the student, and the student and their parents have kind of almost complete choice. But we still aren't happy with higher education. And so I think there's some lessons there for K-12 about what else we need to make sure that system is delivering what we want it to. And because it turns out that while you have a lot of choice in higher education, it's almost blindfolded choice. Like, we really don't know if this is a good college or that's a good college. Like, I don't know whether UT Austin's better than Texas A&M, better than, I guess in this town I better say UT Austin's better. And so we have a lot of choice, but it's blindfolded choice. And so this is kind of one of the lessons for K-12 from higher education.
Thank you, Andrew. Robert, you've told us nicely here about the virtues of classical education and what you've been able to do and the effect it's had on students. What does our audience need to know about the obstacles to the growth and expansion of your movement?
Well, you've already heard some of them referenced, namely that charter laws that were put on the books in the 90s have been essentially incrementally repealed. not formally, right, but by the introduction of, the Leviathan, right? So the sort of labyrinth of regulation that's been added to. My colleagues in California who are in schools very comparable to the ones that I work with are telling me that when they started, and they started late 90s, that they really did have freedom to deliver the model. Since that time, the state has just increasingly imposed upon them various regulations that make it difficult for them to really execute, to deliver. And so this is a real challenge. Certification of teachers, which we have been able to studiously avoid, not because certified teachers may not be fine, but because typically we are not finding the teachers to staff our classrooms from the usual kind of educational apparatus. We're working around that. We're going to liberal arts programs. We've employed more students, more graduates of St. John's College in Annapolis and Santa Fe than anyone else for like 4 years running, right? So we go to those great books colleges, not surprisingly. We go to liberal arts colleges across the country, to honors programs at Baylor. There's actually one here at UTA where we find really well-suited individuals to staff our classrooms. We need the freedom to do that, and when the state begins to meddle with that, when federal interventions happen in various ways, it makes it difficult to deliver the model. I want to quickly just mention, building on what Andrew said, that not only has this ecosystem of homeschooling and private schooling and the charters that I'm working with begun to flourish, but we've influenced higher education indirectly, or maybe directly, by asking, not only by hiring, right, and recruiting from good liberal arts colleges, but by introducing programs now to train teachers in this vein for the classical model. So the University of Dallas was right out front on this, building a program to equip our teachers and train them. There's a school in Philadelphia, Eastern University's Templeton Honors College, which was right behind them. Hillsdale College is interested in this, of course. That won't surprise anyone. And there are another half dozen institutions of higher education that have begun to recognize now this we can get behind. This is important, and this is the wave that will renew education. So good things happening. Another sort of benefit of classical education on higher ed.
Thank you, Robert. We now have time for your questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and one of our folks will come by with a microphone for you. Yes, ma'am.
So, is it? Okay. For the Great Hearts schools, do you all do assessments at all?
Yes, and anything that the state would require of a public school is going to be a part of our rubric, right? So the assessments of language and mathematics, obviously, right, as well as science and the remainder would be part and parcel. And here in Texas, where there are end-of-year assessments, all of that would apply to a Great Hearts Academy as it would to any other public district school.
That's true of any charter school, in Texas at least.
So tell me, why is it that we are not publishing school districts where their kids graduate and cannot pass the assessment for college readiness?
It is published, but it's masked. I mean, there's so much data that is published by the Texas Education Agency that you can imagine if there's a desire to have it conveniently hidden, and there frequently is, then you can't find it unless you're looking for it. But it is possible to look up the college readiness stats of various institutions. There are ways to game those numbers, but if you're just looking at, the percentage of students who say took the SAT or ACT or one other similar test is allowed in Texas, as a college readiness rubric, you can find the percentage of students who took the test, which actually received a cut score. A score that would be considered college ready at most college institutions or by the College Board. I don't have those numbers really fresh in my memory, but you're going to find it, and I feel like I'm being generous here. Around the state, you're going to find that somewhere between 10 and 20% of all students. 20% probably as a statewide average, but much lower than that in certain districts.
Thank you. Other questions? This gentleman over here.
My sister is an artist.
My nephew was a general studies graduate at A&M, and they both could not teach. They had to get a Texas teacher's certificate, which I forced them to do because they were both unemployable with their degrees. What is the present status of that shortcut into being able to be a recognized teacher, both in the public schools and also in charter schools?
Alternative certification is still an option in Texas. In fact, quite a few teachers in Texas schools receive their teacher certification through an alternative method, which means you did not go to college and as your course of study in college receive a teacher's certificate at the end of that. It's honestly debatable whether or not one is better than the other. There are teachers who do great work having gotten an alternative certification. There are teachers who do great work with a traditional, and the flip side of that is true as well. You were asking if there's an exception, and private and charter schools, in fact, quite a few district schools are allowed to receive waivers or exceptions to hire somebody who doesn't have that certification, usually assuming that they're going to receive that certification within a certain period of time. Private schools are technically exempt from certification rules, but they frequently choose to hire certified teachers. They have the prerogative to look at somebody's credentials outside of that. I mean, university professors are usually not certified teachers, if you will. So they have the prerogative to look at somebody's credentials and say, we're fine with that, come and teach in our school, we're confident that you're going to do a great job, or to require something further. Does that help?
I need to know how the example of this very good charter school system, what percentage of people have teacher certification?
Yeah, so it's fairly low. As I mentioned, in Arizona, that requirement is not in effect for teacher certification, but this alternative certification route for our schools here in Texas permits us to bring, again, graduates of these liberal arts colleges in, and then over the course of time, grant them the alternative certification. And I would add, the percentage, thank you. We have probably employed between 15 and 20% who have existing certification. The remainder are getting the add-on or the alternative route. And by the way, again, to just promote higher educational involvement here, we see the University of Dallas promoting a classical track, which will lead to certification. I'd love to see more universities across the country do just the same.
And just to add one comment that Emily kind of hinted at, when you teach at the college level, you get almost no training in actual education, pedagogy, anything like that. So, I mean, I'm a subject matter expert. I've been teaching economics for 15 years, something like that. But I don't think I've ever sat through an education class about how to teach. And that does have some problems. I'm sure I've done some things, I've kind of reinvented the wheel in a lot of cases, but it does avoid a lot of these, like, you must have this certification, where you kind of fit everybody into the same cookie cutter pattern.
Thank you. Other questions? This lady right here.
So kind of tying it back to the title of the day, The War on Poverty, Overcoming Government Dependence in America. I haven't really heard any of you speak about how this is going to be impacting poverty as a whole. And additionally, I think a lot of the conversation today has been around alternatives in K through 12 education and pre-K, but not necessarily in terms of higher education. Speaking for myself, I have my master's in social work. if somebody gets a GED and does an apprenticeship with an electrician, they will make 5 times the amount of money than me. I have kind of doomed myself to a life of poverty. Which is something we can all think about in terms of how we treat our social workers. But yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of tying back what all of you have been speaking about to actually positively impacting poverty. And again, higher education alternatives.
So the thing that jumps immediately to mind to me is getting off of that credential treadmill. And so right now there's a lot of barriers to people getting out of poverty, and one of them is access to a well-paying job, because a lot of those jobs will require a bachelor's, a master's degree, even if those degrees don't actually prepare them for that job. And so as we kind of scale back government involvement, we should see less over kind of production of these surplus degrees. There's a great paper about a decade ago by Mark Bauerlein. He's an English professor, and he counted up how many academic pieces, books, journal articles, that kind of thing, had been written on Shakespeare in the past, I think, 2-3 decades, and it was something like 30,000 pieces had been written on Shakespeare. And so his point was that we're really overproducing some types of scholarship, and we're probably underproducing other types. And so as we kind of right-size supply and demand for what the labor market actually needs, it should be a lot easier for people to find well-paying jobs.
And I would add that a truly liberal education is, I believe, a K-12 education is really an extraordinary way to start your life. 98% of our students are going to go on to college, and many of them to selective colleges. But I'd be delighted to see them enter the vocations to become practitioners of the arts, as it were, the mechanical and physical arts alongside of the fine arts. But that being said, I think a liberal education is in fact the best jumping off point. It is fun for me to watch the tech companies, right, begin to say, we're hiring liberal arts graduates because they can think more holistically. Now, I'm not so sure about the humanities that we've just heard described, and of which I'm quite familiar, but I'm confident that the type of work we're doing to graduate young people who then are discerningly entering college with an eye on what can I do, how can I make a contribution, is in fact giving them the mobility. To your question about poverty, I love to watch, for example, a young man, Caleb Fire Dancing, right? A Native American from Phoenix, from a single mother, single parent home, 3 brothers, who came into one of our schools and whose ambition when he started was just to get through, and he thought his mom was really putting him through the ringer. By the time he finished, he said, I'd been looking for an understanding of what it meant to be a man and to be an American, and I found it in Aristotle and the reading of the Federalist Papers, and I'm now entering society ready. And this is a graduate, right, a high schooler, an 18-year-old. Caleb is, to my money, just proof positive that what we're doing is, in fact, bringing up everyone, right, the rising tide that's causing all boats to float a little higher.
And I'm just going to quote Richard Whitaker really quick to get on the poverty. What does this mean for actual students who may be coming from disadvantaged homes? What does this mean for them? I will quote some research that Corey DeAngelis, who was on the previous panel, has done he's collated a whole bunch of research together and found, along with other scholars, that the academic achievement of students in alternative settings such as charters, as well as the academic achievement of students in nearby traditional schools, tend, on the whole, to increase when those charter or other options are present. So we feel that it is indeed a rising tide that lifts all boats to have these alternatives and this mechanism of choice available. And I'll highlight a few specific examples, some schools that have been created specifically to help students from disadvantaged backgrounds, like IDEA or KIP or other charter school networks in Texas as well as around the country. You'll see 3 to 5 times the college entry and completion rate for low-income students when students have graduated from those networks, as opposed to what you would usually expect from students from that lowest income quintile. So we talk about it because we're passionate about the results that we've seen and the potential that appears to be here to lift students out of poverty and give them a better chance at a life and a future.
Emily, you get the last word. Please join me again in thanking our panelists. And thank you all for attending our event.